Hello again. I welcome you back to my classes. I had to decide. I had to start a bit later today because of connections, internet connections, and some mic problems with microphone. So anyway, welcome to my class. We are talking about the world after the First World War and how World War One affected the development of our world. So we talked before about this general mindset of people, the way they exited from the First World War was that they fell in love with dictatorships, with the strong man, charismatic people. They lost respect for constitution, for republics, for elections, for democratic procedures, because the war with its brutalities instilled society with this martial spirit, martial ethics, and the people got used to resolve the problems through violence. And of course, it affected the political and social system in society. Thus, in many countries, we have dictatorships coming to power. In Russia, in the former Russian Empire, in the former German Empire, we have totalitarian dictatorships coming to power. In Russia, it was Stalin. In Germany, it was Hitler. But all other societies were equally affected by what we find by this martial mindset. Okay, desire to mobilize people, desire to resolve problems from up above, disrespect for constitutional rights. I'm not talking about human rights. It was totally neglected at that time, of course. But even those countries which had a strong democratic tradition, like UK, France, and the United States, they were also affected by this general trend. So today, and it was unavoidable in many respects. It wasn't some type of conspiracy or something. It was naturally expected by the people at that time because the society lived by these ideals. The United States was not an exception in this case. So today we're going to discuss so-called the New Deal, which might be familiar to you. It's associated with the name of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, one of the American presidents, who in fact was a unique politician among all other presidents. Why? Because he was elected by people to his position of president four times. It's the only example in the United States history. So, which also shows us how in those years, 1930s, these interwar years, the time of the big state, big power, strong, charismatic leaders, FDR fit in, and he was accepted as one of these people. Of course, in the United States, we don't see these totalitarian excesses. You know, it was a democratic country with the freedom of press, freedom of speech. But even in the United States, we have some infringement of the big government on economic life, on political life, on judicial life, and you will see it. Okay, so let's go to our conversation, our lecture on the New Deal. Okay. First, I want to remind to you this scheme, the chart. I showed it to you. Okay, that shows that how the whole world was captured in this trend, global trend. Okay. The trend of big state, big government. Okay. In many respects, in the world, including the United States, this ascent of the big government was related to their Great Depression, when economic shutdown, when countries, the stock market crash in New York, and then when all countries started to isolate themselves from each other economically. They had trade wars, okay. But the roots of this economic crisis, as I said last time, went back to World War One, when economy was distorted, when American agriculture was artificially amplified, was forced to produce more and to deliver grain to Europe, where agriculture was squashed because of the warfare. And after war was over, American farming started to decline, and by 1929 it was in a deep crisis. Plus, banks were issuing easy credit. People were taking credit left and right, even used credit money for gambling, for everything. So it was out of control. Destruction of sound money, so government printed money. Inflation was promoted by the war, because through the printing money, the government tried to subsidize their military activities, the military economy, militarized economy, because if you have sound money, gold standard, government will have no money to waste. But if you have lift a country from a gold standard, so in this case there will be no control over the government, so they can print money as much as they want, and they can ruin the economy. So it opens the doors to the abuse, to the wars. They can finance the wars at our expense, because when government prints money, as you know, it creates inflation. But inflation, it's not noticeable right away. You notice it 1, 2, 3 years later, little by little, okay? But when it's too late, the money loses its value. So all Western countries suffered a severe downturn. In the United States, there was unemployment 20%. So by the way, now we are very close to this Great Depression situation. But at that time, economy experienced this economic crisis. But now it's a man-made crisis because of this pandemic, whatever. So we are squashing our economy. We are destroying our economy. But anyway, it's another problem. Okay, people thought that free market capitalism and business people were evil. They were responsible for the Great Depression. Okay, of course they never blamed government. Okay, because government people believed in this big government that would save them. Okay, but many came to conclusion, including the United States, that free enterprise was bad thing. It should be replaced by some kind of, not necessarily socialism, but progressivism, by the total control of the government over economy. When, after all, in the war, everything was mobilized. Everybody was mobilized. Everybody knew his or her place, and everything was running smoothly in the eyes of these people. Okay, so. What do we need? How do we resolve the problem? So remember, in Germany it was National Socialism. In Soviet Union it was from early on communism. Okay, there was fascism. It's the power of the big state, like a weak, soft totalitarianism. Italy, Spain, Portugal, Romania, Poland. Okay, not as brutal as in Germany or the Soviet Union. Okay. There was also democratic socialism in such countries like Sweden, France, and in the United States and UK, governments were building so-called welfare capitalism. Okay, and that particular system survived to the present day. We live under this system. So today we are discussing how this system of the welfare capitalism emerged in the United States in 1930s. Okay. But the gist of the system is that it's the faith in the power of the big government, benevolent government. Okay, benevolent government that would distribute, that would take care of the people, so everybody would be well secured, fed, and there should be a strong, charismatic leader, like a father. He would be taking care of the people. So that was what on the minds of the people. Millions of people believed in this. Again, I'm not trying to emphasize right now they're good or bad. That's what people believed. Okay, like in medieval times they believed in one thing. Now in 1930s, in the wake of the war, they believed in another thing. Okay, so in Western democracies were not an exception to this general rule that a drive in favor of the big government, to accept the big government as the savior of the world. Okay, welfare capitalism. Here you can see a picture of a very important man. His name is John Maynard Keynes. He was one of the greatest economists in the last century. Okay, he was the founder of so-called Keynesianism, and political economic policies. I'm sorry for this, sounds not good, but political and economic policies which became the foundation of the welfare state in the West. Okay, at first in the United States and UK, and later it was also accepted in France, in Germany, in Sweden. Okay, the Swedish Democratic Socialists also switched to Keynesianism later. Keynes, he was not against capitalism and he was not against socialism at the same time. He was thinking about that we need some kind of mix of two things. Okay, he insisted that the market, if not regulated by a big government, was a very dangerous thing. It might destroy people, it might kill them, it would make them hungry, angry, and in fact, he actually, at that time, 1930s, he pointed to what was going on in the real life. He said, if governments would not throw something, would not do something for the people, people might smash these governments, and United States, UK, and would bring some kind of dictatorships. I doubt it would have happened, but that's what was used by the architects of the welfare capitalism to justify what they were doing. Okay, he argued that in a time of economic crisis, governments should spend money, okay, no matter what, wherever they can, to do what? To employ people, to keep people busy, because during the Great Depression, up to 20% of people, for example, in the United States, lost their jobs, and Keynes argued, just keep them artificially busy, give them some kind of public jobs to paint whatever benches in the park, or even he once said, even if they dig trench and then bury it again, it was okay, as long as you kind of throw this money, because it's very dangerous to keep people idle. See, right now we're using another, since the society, American society is the richest society in the world, so we're using another society. We keep people idle, but we pay them, okay, because society, the government accumulated, and society in general accumulated so much money. But at that time, to pay people a little bit of money to stay on the job, you need to print more money. Don't be afraid to print money, he said to the governments. Inflation is okay because people don't see it right away. Consequences of inflation is not as noticeable. If one thing, he said, for instance, to fire a person or to cut his or her salary, it would make person angry. But if you print money, and nobody will notice it right away. Nobody will notice. Okay, only later, I repeat, 1 year or 2 years later. Okay, so inflation is okay. It's basically like a grand political cheating, but which is acceptable. Otherwise, people would be angry. Okay, it's an acceptable way to exit the crisis, he said. He also said that nations' self-isolation was okay in the time of crisis. And FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democratic candidate who presided over so-called New Deal. I repeat, New Deal. The New Deal, it's what built in the United States the foundation of the welfare capitalism. FDR became like a spearhead of this type of Keynesianism. But originally, he was not a Keynesian. Okay, originally he was thinking along different lines. FDR competed in 1933 with the Republican incumbent Herbert Hoover, who was an engineer by profession. So he was a sort of great engineer. Okay, so let's discuss a bit this guy Herbert Hoover, the Republican president, what he was and what kind of missteps he did and why he was in such a big trouble. So 1929, when unemployment was spreading around, when the economy was declining because of this crisis, there was much social unrest. Communist and socialist movement was on the rise in the United States. In fact, the total number of members of the Communist Party USA reached 100,000 people, so a lot. So Herbert Hoover, Republican, created a big mess at that time. At first, to help people, he cut taxes, but at the same time he raised spendings. He started public works, as I said before, trying to keep people busy, to give them some kind of public works, public jobs, some community works, to do something useful, to plant trees, bushes, to paint the benches, whatever. But this didn't bring him any money, because he cut taxes, raised spendings. So he didn't bring the treasury any money. Then he did the reverse thing. He raised taxes up to 60% of income, 60% of people's income taxes. Can you imagine? 65% of your check goes to the government. And cut spendings, which created anger. People were petrified. Okay, they were angry with him. Then he imposed customs barriers to protect US companies from foreign competition, which ignited the trade war in the world, because Germany retaliated, also shut down her country for foreign trade. England shut down her economy for foreign trade, her borders for foreign trade. Okay, and which created this economic disarray, crisis. Okay. And 1933, there was a time for new elections, presidential elections, and that's when FDR, this man, comes to the picture. He was a Democratic candidate. By the way, during the war, First World War, he was Deputy Secretary of Navy, as far as I remember. Yeah, Deputy Secretary of Navy. So he was involved in the warfare, in military economy, and the reason I'm stressing this is to show you that later he was using this martial military methods of mobilization to fight the Great Depression. Okay, so Roosevelt offered a new deal for America. Okay, and since Herbert Hoover popularity was sinking so low, nobody liked him, people voted for FDR just to decide to try something new. Okay. Roosevelt wins with 60% of the vote. 2/3 of Western and Southern farmers voted for him. In fact, at first he didn't do anything new. He actually continued to expand governmental programs started by Hoover. Okay, in the long run, he introduced more planning, more control of economy. But the first decision he made, it's interesting, in 1933. In order to win the popularity of the people, the first decision he made in 1933, before he did banking reforms, before he expanded governmental spendings, he did a totally reverse thing. He kind of pretended that he was going against governmental regulations, which won them sympathies of those people who didn't like big government. What he did, he repealed the prohibition laws. If you know US history, in 1919, because of some religious Republicans, there was a moral crusade against the alcohol drinking, and Republicans, some who were extremely religious, they were pushing this agenda of prohibition, and eventually majority of the states agreed this, and so a nationwide prohibition law was adopted, which was outrageous because it led to gangster wars, to illegal smuggling of liquor, illegal moonshining, illegal like black market sale of alcohol. Crime was on the rise. It's a similar situation like right now with these drugs, with marijuana, when it's on the one hand it's so widespread, on the other hand police chases this elusive crime, because a lot of people involved into this were penalized for using these light drugs. At the same time, people were penalized in before 1933 for either drinking alcohol, illegal alcohol, or selling illegal alcohol. There were a lot of legal cases around this, so everybody came to hate it eventually. So Roosevelt he became increasingly popular after this decision. So people, many Republicans loved him too, because he did this. He repealed this law which people hated. Okay. But overall, FDR did dramatically increase involvement of government in economic and social life. So FDR expanded what Hoover started. Okay, spending dramatically increased. There was a large deficit spending. Before, United States did not accumulate so much deficit, but FDR said it's okay. And in fact, John Maynard Keynes wrote him a letter. He said, "Oh, Mr. Roosevelt, I welcome your spendings. Say, yes, you need to spend as much as possible. Public works, crisis should be drowned into money. Print money, so it's good. So you follow my advice." And then they even met each other. Okay, when Keynes came to New York and met FDR. So what I mentioned before, it's a so-called dry law. Okay, see, the dry law was repealed. Another popular thing introduced by FDR was so-called FDIC. You probably know when you go to your banking website, you will see that it says FDIC insured. It means your deposits, whatever you have in your bank, these are insured by the Federal Deposits Insurance Corporation. Okay, it means in case of crisis, something desperate, like for instance, right now, our economy is going down in 4 or 5 months if we don't stop this playing this stuff. If we don't stop shutting down the economy, our economy will be in ruins. We will have a second Great Depression. So, and some banks might be ruined. But in this case, supposedly, if a bank gets out of business, let's imagine, I hope it will not happen in a like extreme situation. If your bank goes out of business and your deposits will evaporate, so the government will compensate you up to $100,000. So don't have more than $100,000. So for the first time, this measure was introduced and adopted by Congress under FDR. It's 1934, I think, 1934 FDIC. Okay, so insurance of your deposits. At that time, of course, it was a small amount. I don't remember, up to 50,000 something. But now it's, I know for sure, it's up to 100,000 in our days. Okay, so before 1933, no banking deposits were insured. Okay, then he created something which led to dubious results. It's a National Recovery Administration, so-called NRA. He thought it would improve economic performance of the United States. In fact, it choked economy. It prolonged depression. It made things worse. Okay, so let me mention what it is. So, National Recovery Administration, it was a governmental bureau that watched, they set the prices. They said, business people, you cannot set your prices on your own. So we have to tell you what prices you need to set. Wages also shouldn't be set by the businesses. We will tell you what kind of wages you need to set. You cannot do it beyond certain limit. Okay. And also, most important, government decided how much companies should produce, like hypothetically thinking, hypothetically speaking, not necessarily hypothetically. In fact, they did it, like coming to automobile factories and telling people how many cars they should produce. Okay, so the point was to keep the prices high because the government thought there were so many products, so we don't need so many products. We need to shrink production, and that's what keeps the prices up. Okay. In fact, NRA introduced so-called the codes of fair competition. So in all branches of our economy, they introduced codes of fair competition. Like, for example, I will give you an example. Like in dry cleaning business, government set a particular price. You were not supposed to charge, let's say, more than 35 cents for pressing clothing, for pressing shirts, suits, and no more suits and whatever, pants, no more than 35 cents. Okay, so if you charge less, it means you try to beat your people who belong to your guild of dry cleaners. Okay, and it's not fair. So it's a bizarre, because in real life, it's market that should decide how much people should charge, And in fact, there was a famous legal case against a Polish Jewish dry cleaning business owner. He owned a small dry cleaning business, like one small room where he pressed clothing, washed clothing. So he charged less than 35 cents, and neighbors, snitches, reported on him. You know, in fact, these days, recently, remember, L.A. Mayor, I think, encouraged people of California to snitch on each other, to report, you know, if so, those people who do not observe quarantine, you know. So I guess the tradition survived. Anyway, this Polish Jewish dry cleaner, he was reported by his neighbors because he charged for pressing clothing less, 10 cents less, and he was brought to trial. He was put in prison. So it was a signal to the business that you shouldn't ignore the governmental codes. And in fact, businesses were forced to be compliant. Okay, so those who complied with these fair codes of competition, they were supposed to put on their doors, on gates, whatever, if it was a big company, this eagle. And should have brought you a picture, but you can Google NRA eagle. So if you Google it, you will see this symbol or emblem of NRA. So those businesses who accepted this regulation, and you had to accept, because if you were not compliant, you could be ostracized. A bunch of governmental goons were after you. So you were forced by the government, by the public opinion. So you could not dissent in this case. So businesses, a lot of businesses, 99% of them raised their hands and said, we give up. Yes, they put this code, emblems, eagles. It meant the code of compliance. We comply with the requirements of NRA. But at the same time, Supreme Court challenged this. They said it's unconstitutional to telling businesses what to set the prices, to set the wages. It's not right. Okay. And later, a Supreme Court actually kicked out this executive decision by FDR. Okay, and that made him mad. In fact, when FDR was coming to power during his inauguration in 1933, he uttered the famous phrase in his inauguration address. He said, "I'm going to resolve this crisis. In this time of emergency, I'm demanding emergency powers." You know, that's a famous phrase. You know, unfortunately, you know, I don't have video with me, you know, but in my classroom, when I have a chance to teach this class, I show this video clip. You know, I did not set for this particular lecture this video. My fault. Anyway, in the same manner, U.S. agriculture was treated. Here, the government regulated production, cutting production, curtailing production through so-called Agricultural Adjustment Act. Okay, Congress adopted Agricultural Adjustment Act, created Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which did what? This AAA paid farmers to cut their crops, not to sow so many, not to plow so much land, not to sow so much corn, not to sow like wheat, whatever, rye. Okay, wheat mostly, corn. Not to expand cotton fields. Okay, so farmers were paid to cut their production in order to keep the prices up. It's I call it Stalinism upside down. You know, in the Soviet Union, they were extracting produce from the people and trying to sell it, dump it at the cheap prices to the West in order to raise money for industrial revolution. But here they were destroying the food, meat, destroying the meat animals, produce in order to keep the prices up. Okay, so if you there are some coffee table books published about this Great Depression. If you go into this, if you look through coffee table books or just Google pictures, Great Depression, you will see a bunch of images when coffee was used for fuel in trains. Okay, when oranges were destroyed by tractors, when milk was drained in the sewage system, okay, because government paid farmers for cutting these products, okay. The most notorious incident, which actually made many Americans to question this administration and its activities, was slaughter of 6 million pigs. Okay, the government paid farmers for so-called stock reduction program. 6 million pigs were killed. Government said that you had too many pigs. It diminishes the prices for bacon. In order to keep the prices for bacon on a higher level, we have to kill the pigs. And of course, it didn't look good when in 1930, winter 1930, 3,000 people died from hunger in New York City. 3,000 people in the winter 1930-1931 died from hunger in New York City. But in the meantime, government paid farmers to kill 6 million pigs, and some of this meat was destroyed. Only after newspapers publicized this horrible thing, government started to kind of preserve this meat, distributing this meat as a food help to hungry people. Okay, very outrageous, of course. It was outrageous. In fact, interesting thing, to the present, this silly program, I don't know exactly the fate, but I know that recently, I survived until recently. I checked like 10 years ago, this program was still in force, and in Tennessee, some of our farmers were still paid by the government for not growing produce. Of course, it was not phrased like this, it just became like an annual subsidy to farmers, because where after the war, after 1930s, 1940s, government tried to eliminate this program of paying farmers for not planting produce, for not growing pigs that was relevant for them at that time. They tried to curtail this program, but the farming lobby didn't allow it, and eventually government converted this program into annual subsidies to farmers. So until recently, we still had these some subsidies to farmers, this welfare, farming welfare, I call it. So you can check on your own, because some Congress people raise this issue. Why should we keep it, subsidize this? Is it, maybe it's a high time to curtail this program? Okay. Another way to deal with, one of the ways to deal with the huge unemployment was so-called civilian concentration camp. Young people gave the huge percentage of unemployed people. So that is why to give immediate employment to young people was an urgent issue, and the government decided to do it, like following this instant advice by John Keynes that people should be employed somewhere, somehow, and paid a little bit of money. So the CCC gave temporary work to 2 million unemployed young men between ages 17 and 29. Each young man received $30 per month, but only $8 were given to him in his hands, because government was afraid that they might spend it for cigarettes and alcohol. So 22 went back to their families, and what they did, they planted trees, mostly planted trees, grasses, bushes. They were building national parks. A lot of national parks, which we have right now, were built as part of this CCC program by these young males, okay, who were temporarily employed in the wake of the Great Depression. These young men usually lived in tents and fields. As I said, much of the greater part of the activities of CCC was focused on planting trees and bushes. Where in Central Plains, as you probably know, during Great Depression, there was another tragedy that kind of descended on U.S. farmers. In addition to the dropping prices for their produce, okay, this tragedy was called Dust Bowl. You heard about Dust Bowl? It's when since the very end of the 19th century and up to 1920s, when American farming was booming because of the war in Europe, I repeat again, because Europe needed food and the farming was destroyed, European farming, and that's when American farming was booming, because American farmers filled this niche that was created by the war. Okay, so they plowed so many lands in Central Plains, they destroyed this grass level, the grasses that kept the fertile soil intact, and when the winds started blowing in Central Plains, these winds eventually destroyed this top fertile soil, and that is why we still have so many badlands. If you go to South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska, you will see the so-called badlands, the badlands that could not be cultivated. So anyway, these young males were employed to plant trees, bushes, sow grasses, throw the seeds of grasses to kind of regreen, so to speak, regreen these Great Plains areas to make sure that another topsoil would be formed or grass would grow to keep the soil intact. Okay. And the life in these CCCs were organized in a martial way. They were treated as drafted people in a military manner, simply because the tents were given by U.S. Army to the CCC. Some commanders came from CCC, or former U.S. military people. So these folks who were in charge of these camps came from U.S. military. So it was like a militarized, semi-militarized organization, CCC. So they were marching, they cultivated this martial spirit. Okay. To the present day, there's a lot of controversy about New Deal in the United States, among historians as well. Okay. And I'm going to talk about these controversies. First, I would like to stress that the Supreme Court declared several programs of FDR illegal, unconstitutional. NRA, remember, that tried to set the prices, wages, to control businesses, what they should produce, what they shouldn't produce. The Supreme Court also said the CCC was illegal. Okay. But FDR hated it. So to defeat the Supreme Court, he threatened to increase the number of Supreme Court justices from 9 to 15, and to pack these remaining vacancies with his own people, with his friends. And of course, the Supreme Court, of course, they could struggle against him in this case, but they were afraid they might lose. So they decided to compromise. Okay. So whatever they repealed, they said, you will observe, but at the same time, we will close your eyes on your next executive decisions you might make. So by his executive decisions, he again reintroduced the CCC in a different way, and the public works were reintroduced, and NRA was not completely revived, but was partially revived, because government did control how people were paid, and how much companies produced. Okay. So this example of FDR trying to infringe on the Supreme Court shows that FDR was ready to fight against the Supreme Court. He was ready to kind of cut, at least partially, the system of checks and balances. And I'm sure under different circumstances, if, for instance, if it hadn't been for a strong Republican tradition in the United States, I'm sure people like FDR, they would have ended up being some kind of small tyrants. Okay. I wouldn't say some kind of brutal person, but a kind of benevolent tyrant, let me say. But because of this powerful US tradition, Republican tradition, traditional checks and balances, when three branches of power were to balance each other, his authoritarian aspirations were curtailed. At least he could not go far enough. Okay. Let's make an assessment of the Supreme Court of the New Deal. Okay. For many Americans, especially at that time, FDR did restore optimism. Otherwise, they wouldn't have elected him 4 times. So he was popular, more popular than anybody else. That's the fact. He provided immediate relief to many, popular with masses. Okay, 4 times, as I said, was elected as the president. But at the same time, there is something about him which is also true. He did not actually fix the depression. No, he prolonged it because he didn't allow businesses to spread their wings. Unemployment never went below 17%. It was a very high, okay, very high. It was only when the war started, Second World War started, what historians tell us that FDR resolved the problem, finally fixed the economy, although it was not fixed. In reality, 12 million US males were drafted into the US Army in auxiliary direct combat action, auxiliary army services. Okay, overall draft was 12 million people. That's how he resolved unemployment. Okay, quote unquote. Of course, it wasn't a resolution. And he did not, I repeat, he did not fix the economy. In fact, for many private investors, for many businesses, he created a regime of uncertainty because he didn't trust business people. In fact, at some point in 1936, he believed that businesses were plotting, conspiring against him, and he even asked FBI to investigate several prominent business people if they conspired against him. So, which is totally bizarre. Of course, nobody conspired against him. So he was prone to this type of paranoia. He was increasing governmental control, regulation. Okay, but the most dangerous, he created this regime uncertainty when people were not sure, because he was speaking against businesses. He was speaking against these. At some point, he even talked about money changers who invaded our temple. Something like this. So it created insecurity among business people. Everybody was afraid to invest money. So metaphorically speaking, people were hiding their money, hoarding the wealth, which is very dangerous because money did not work. Remember, we talked about the Spanish Empire, where people were hoarding money, hiding them in a mattress, and people were afraid to invest them. So unemployment was huge under FDR. Okay, he kind of radiated this sense of optimism, and of course psychologically he captivated people. But actually, in economic life, he did not improve the economic performance. Okay, the real economic performance in the United States, a good performance, started in 1945, 1946 only, as late as 1945, 1946. Okay, and unfortunately, he was the first president who started putting our nation in debt. So the problem we are facing the present day now, it's getting out of control. This national debt is huge right now. So it was amplified during Obama years. It was even more amplified under Trump. So right now it's so huge. It's like Google, US national debt, you will be petrified. It's trillions of dollars. Okay, but FDR was the first who put us in debt. Okay, because he needed these funds to subsidize his welfare programs he started, social security he started. He needed money to subsidize public works, these CCC, and there was also, I didn't mention it here, I don't have time, Work Progress Administration, so another public works program, okay, which he created to bypass these restrictions of the Supreme Court. So millions and millions of dollars, he put our nation in debt, and we don't know how to get out of this situation. There is no way to get out of this situation. So on this slightly pessimistic note, let me finish this. And of course, unfortunately, he made more people dependent on the government dole, welfare society. Okay, but some people say it was unavoidable under those circumstances. Okay, but we have to deal with this to the present day. Okay. And that's the end of today's conversation. I will see you next time. Thank you so much for your attention. Bye bye.